There are certain people who enter your life not like a gentle tide, but like a tectonic shift. They arrive disguised as something ordinary, a doctor, a friend, a temporary fixture in a period of crisis. And only in looking back do you realize they were never ordinary at all. They were the architects of a new landscape within you, the cartographers who redrew the maps of your own heart. They don't just change your life. They rearrange the very foundations of it, building something stronger and more beautiful where there was once only ruin. For me, that person was Elias Vance. He was the man who pieced my body back together. But more than that, he was the one who waited patiently for my soul to catch up, who showed me that the most profound healing happens not in the stark white rooms of a hospital, but in the quiet, shared spaces between two people learning to be whole again. He was asleep. That was the first coherent thought that managed to surface through the thick, warm fog of the moment. His head was a heavy, comforting weight in my lap, the dark curls of his hair spilling over the worn denim of my jeans. The rhythmic, even whisper of his breath was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the frantic, silent scream of my own pulse in my ears. The television was still on, casting flickering blue and gold light across his face, sculpting his cheekbones and the strong line of his jaw out of the shadows. He looked younger in sleep, the constant tension he carried in his shoulders as a surgeon finally released, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes smoothed away. He looked peaceful, and my heart, that traitorous and hopeful muscle in my chest, ached with a tenderness so vast and so terrifying it felt like it might swallow me whole. This was the precipice. I had been living on it for months, this knife's edge of a friendship that felt like something more, but had never been defined as such. My hand hovered in the air inches from his hair, a satellite caught in a gravitational pull it could not escape. I wanted, more than anything, to touch him, to simply brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead, to feel the warmth of his skin under my fingertips. It was such a simple gesture, one that would mean nothing and everything all at once. But I couldn't. My fingers trembled with the sheer force of my restraint. To touch him now, while he was asleep and vulnerable, felt like a transgression. It felt like taking something that hadn't been offered, like admitting to a truth I had kept locked away in the deepest chambers of my own being for years. This strange, fragile ecosystem we had built was predicated on a delicate balance of unspoken rules and plausible deniability. He was the lonely friend seeking comfort after a brutal breakup. I was the safe harbor, the steady presence who asked for nothing in return. Any move I made could shatter that illusion, could send him retreating back into the safety of his own world, leaving me alone in the wreckage of what I had dared to hope for. The room was a geography of our shared history. On the coffee table, two empty mugs sat where we'd had tea, his favorite chamomile, mine a bitter green he always wrinkled his nose at. A photography book I'd been showing him lay open, its pages filled with stark black and white landscapes of places I dreamed of seeing again, places I wasn't sure my reconstructed body would ever allow me to reach. His jacket was slung over the back of my armchair, a familiar dark shape that had become as much a part of my apartment's decor as my own belongings. He was seeping into the cracks of my life, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were there. And every night he ended up here, asleep on my couch, or, more recently and more terrifyingly, in my bed. The chasm of unspoken things between us grew wider and deeper, even as the physical distance shrank to nothing. I was drowning in his proximity, in the scent of his soap and the low murmur of his voice and the casual intimacy he offered so freely, so unconsciously. I didn't know if he was oblivious to the current pulling me under, or if he was simply pretending not to see. He shifted in his sleep, his face turning further into my leg, a soft sigh escaping his lips. My breath hitched. It was too much. This casual ownership of my space, of my person. It was a brand of exquisite torture to be given this much, but not the one thing I truly wanted. I looked at the door to my apartment, a solid plane of wood that separated this quiet, charged sanctuary from the rest of the world. In my mind, I saw myself getting up, gently moving his head to a pillow and walking out that door. Just walking away. It would be the sensible thing to do, the act of self-preservation. To end this before it ended me. But I knew I wouldn't. I couldn't. Because as much as it hurt, this state of suspended animation, the hope it offered was a more powerful anesthetic than any pain. So I stayed, perfectly still, a statue carved from longing and fear, letting the weight of him anchor me in place, and I watched him breathe in the flickering light, wondering how long a heart could live on a diet of almost. To understand how we arrived in that quiet, complicated space, you would have to go back 2 years, to the moment my world shattered. It happened on a sheer rock face in the Sierras, a place that had always felt more like a cathedral to me than any man-made structure. I was a photographer, and my specialty was capturing the kinetic poetry of the human body pushed to its limits. I photographed climbers, skiers, trail runners, people who found their truth at the edge of endurance. Often, I was right there with them, harnessed in, feeling the same adrenaline, the same sun, the same wind. On that day, the wind was a fickle thing. A sudden, violent gust caught me at the worst possible moment as I was transitioning my weight. My grip failed. The sickening lurch in my stomach was instantaneous, followed by the horrifying, frictionless slide, the scrape of rope, the shouted warnings of my climbing partner that sounded like they were coming from a million miles away. And then, the impact. It wasn't a sharp pain, not at first. It was a dull, final thud that seemed to extinguish all the light and sound in the universe. My last conscious thought was not one of fear, but of profound, disappointing silence. I met Dr. Elias Vance in the blinding, antiseptic white of a hospital room. For the first week, he was just a presence, a deep, calm voice that cut through the morphine haze. He was the one who explained the damage in steady, precise terms: a shattered femur, a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, a hairline fracture in my L4 vertebra. He used words like comminuted and internal fixation, words that sounded clinical and detached from the visceral reality of the brokenness I felt inside my own skin. He was the lead orthopedic surgeon, the man whose job it was to take the jigsaw puzzle of my bones and put them back together. In those early days, I hated him a little. I hated his confidence, his clean white coat, his undamaged body. He was a symbol of everything I had just lost: mobility, freedom, the very core of my identity. He would come into my room, his footsteps sure and quiet on the linoleum, and he would look at my charts, at the ghostly images of my injuries on the light box, and then he would look at me. And that was when the hatred began to falter. Because when Elias looked at me, he didn't just see a collection of broken parts. I'd seen that look from other doctors, a kind of professional detachment, the mechanic assessing the damaged machine. Elias was different. His eyes, a startlingly warm shade of hazel, held a different kind of focus. He saw the frustration, the fear, the silent, simmering rage I couldn't put into words. He saw me. He would ask questions that had nothing to do with my pain levels or my medication schedule. He asked about my photography. He asked what it felt like to be up on that rock face before the fall. He listened, truly listened, as I haltingly tried to explain the feeling of being suspended between the earth and the sky. He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply nodded, his expression one of genuine curiosity, of empathy. He treated me like a person who had a life before this room, and, more importantly, like a person who would have one after. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of my recovery. It was a slow, arduous process, measured in millimeters of movement and excruciating sessions of physical therapy. Elias was no longer my primary surgeon after the initial operations, but he made a point of stopping by my room whenever he was on the floor. He'd lean against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, and just talk to me. We talked about books, about the terrible coffee in the hospital cafeteria, about the migratory patterns of birds he'd read about in some journal. Our conversations were an oasis in the desert of my long, painful days. He was the one who, seeing my despair at being confined, arranged for me to be wheeled out to a small, neglected hospital garden. He sat with me in the watery afternoon sun, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than pain or despair. I felt a flicker of peace. He pushed me in physical therapy, but not in the brusque, clinical way of the therapists. He understood the psychological component of the battle I was fighting. He knew my identity was tied to my physicality, and he helped me reframe my goals. It wasn't about getting back to climbing, not yet. It was about being able to walk to the end of the hallway. It was about being able to hold my heavy camera again. He celebrated the small victories with me, a quiet smile or a nod of approval that felt more rewarding than any medal. He was the one who brought me my camera from my apartment. It sat on my bedside table for weeks, an accusation and a reminder of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. One day, he picked it up, handling it with a reverence that surprised me. He asked me to show him how it worked. And so, I spent an hour explaining apertures and shutter speeds, the delicate dance of light and shadow, to the man who had literally rebuilt the architecture of my body. In that moment, I felt like myself again, a teacher, an artist, not just a patient. By the time I was discharged, leaning heavily on crutches and facing months more of outpatient therapy, the line between doctor and friend had irrevocably blurred. The day I left, he walked me to the hospital entrance. The professional boundary was firmly back in place. He was Dr. Vance, wishing his patient well. But as I was about to get into the cab, he put a hand on my shoulder. "Leo," he said, his voice softer, losing its clinical edge. "If you need anything at all, call me." He handed me a small card, not his official hospital contact, but his personal number, written in a surprisingly messy script. That small piece of cardstock felt heavier and more significant than any prescription I had been given. It felt like a key. I didn't call him for a week. I was terrified of being a burden, of misinterpreting a kind gesture for something more. I was navigating my own apartment like a foreign country, every task a monumental effort. I was lonely, profoundly lonely, in a way that echoed in the empty spaces of my home. Finally, driven by a desperation that overrode my pride, I sent him a text. Just a simple question about one of the exercises my new physical therapist had given me. It was a flimsy pretext, but it was all I had. He responded almost immediately, not with a clinical answer, but with a question. "Are you busy tonight?" I was thinking of ordering pizza, my treat, and that was how it began. He came over that night, and we ate pizza out of a cardboard box on my living room floor because I couldn't yet manage sitting at my dining table. We talked for hours, and it was easy, effortless. He didn't treat me like I was fragile. He just treated me like Leo. Over the next year, our friendship solidified. It became the bedrock of my new, post-accident life. He helped me move my darkroom equipment so it was more accessible. He drove me to appointments when my leg was aching too badly to manage the bus. He became a fixture in my life, a constant, steady presence. And somewhere along the way, my gratitude and admiration began to morph into something deeper, something more complicated. I started noticing things. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. The way he would run a hand through his hair when he was stressed or thinking hard. The inherent gentleness in his hands, those skilled, healing hands, whether he was resetting a bone or just passing me a book. I fell in love with him slowly, and then all at once. It was a quiet, hopeless kind of love, the kind you nurture in secret because the friendship it threatens is too precious to risk. He was with someone, a woman named Clara, a lawyer who was smart and beautiful and, by all accounts, perfect for him. I met her a few times. I was polite. I smiled. And I went home and felt the familiar, dull ache of wanting something I could never have. I buried my feelings deep, tended to them in the dark, and contented myself with the gift of his friendship, telling myself it was more than enough. The shift began on a Tuesday in October. It was raining, a miserable, persistent downpour that matched the gray mood that had settled over the city. Elias called me, his voice strained and unnaturally flat. He asked if he could come over. He didn't give a reason, and I didn't ask for one. When I opened the door, he was soaked, his dark coat dripping onto my welcome mat, his hair plastered to his forehead. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They looked hollowed out, utterly exhausted. He walked past me into the living room without a word, and sank onto the couch, staring at nothing. I made him a cup of tea, the way he liked it, and sat in the armchair opposite him, waiting. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the rain against the window pane. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "She's gone. Clara. She left." He told me the story in disjointed fragments. It wasn't one big, dramatic event, but a slow erosion. The long hours he worked, the emotional toll of his job that he brought home with him, the different paths they saw for their futures. He spoke with a kind of clinical detachment, as if he were diagnosing a patient, but I could see the raw pain beneath the surface. He wasn't just sad, he was adrift. Clara had been his anchor for 5 years, the organizing principle of his life outside the hospital. Without her, he was lost. He didn't cry. He just sat there, hollowed out, and I sat with him, a silent witness to his quiet devastation. He stayed late that night, long after the rain had stopped. When he finally stood to leave, he looked unsteady, as if a strong wind could knock him over. At the door, he paused and turned back to me. "Thanks, Leo," he said, and the gratitude in his voice was so profound, so vulnerable, it made my own chest ache in sympathy. For just being here. That night was the beginning of the new chapter, the one where the carefully drawn boundaries of our friendship began to dissolve like watercolor in the rain. He started coming over almost every night after his shift. He'd arrive looking gray with exhaustion, shed his coat and his shoes, and collapse onto my couch. Sometimes we would talk, but more often than not, we would just exist in the same space. I would work on editing photos on my laptop, the soft click of the keyboard a familiar rhythm. He would read, or just stare into space, his mind clearly miles away. He said my apartment was quiet, that it was the only place he felt he could breathe. His own apartment, the one he had shared with Clara, was too full of ghosts, every object a memory, every room an echo of a life that was no longer his. My home became his sanctuary. I tried to take care of him in the small ways I knew how. I made sure there was always food in the fridge he liked. I kept his favorite tea stocked. I learned to read his moods, to know when he needed to talk and when he needed the healing balm of silence. He was like a man recovering from a long illness, and I, who knew the landscape of recovery so intimately, simply tried to be a steady presence, a landmark he could orient himself by in his own fog of grief and confusion. I told myself that was all it was. I was repaying a debt. He had been my anchor when I was broken, and now I was his. It was a neat, tidy explanation that allowed me to ignore the dangerous, hopeful fluttering in my own chest every time he walked through my door. I was his friend. That was my role, and I played it to perfection, burying my own needs, my own impossible desires, under layers of practiced, patient care. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. It started with him falling asleep on the couch. It would happen late at night. We'd be watching some mindless documentary on television, and I'd look over and his head would be lolled to the side, his breathing deep and even. The first few times, I would gently wake him, tell him he should probably go home to his own bed. He would blink at me, disoriented, and stumble out into the night, looking lost and even more exhausted than when he'd arrived. I started to feel guilty about sending him away, knowing he was driving while bone-tired, returning to an empty, silent apartment. So, the next time it happened, I didn't wake him. I simply took the Afghan from the back of the armchair and draped it over him. I turned off the television and left him there, a sleeping giant in the quiet landscape of my living room. I went to my own bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake for hours, acutely aware of his presence just one room away. The knowledge of him being there, safe and asleep under my roof, was both a profound comfort and a source of unbearable tension. This became the new normal for a few weeks. Elias would come over, we would eat or talk or watch a movie, and he would inevitably drift off on the couch. I would cover him with the blanket and retreat to my room. It was a pattern, a silent agreement. But then came the night that changed the texture of everything. He had come from a particularly grueling 24-hour shift. There had been a multi-car pile-up on the interstate, and he had spent the entire day and night in surgery, piecing people together. He looked like a ghost when he arrived, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes shadowed with a level of exhaustion I had never seen in him before, not even in the worst days of his breakup. He barely spoke, just nodded when I offered him food, which he then only pushed around his plate. He fell asleep on the couch before 9 o'clock, completely and utterly spent. Around 2 in the morning, I was woken by a sound, a soft, distressed murmur from the living room. I got out of bed and padded silently down the hallway. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated him. He was tangled in the blanket, his brow furrowed, his body tense. He was caught in a nightmare, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He let out another soft cry, a sound of such raw pain that it felt like a physical blow. Without thinking, I knelt beside the couch and put a hand on his shoulder. "Elias," I whispered. "Hey, it's okay. You're okay." His eyes flew open, wide and unfocused, clouded with the residue of his dream. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. It took him a long moment to recognize me, for the geography of my living room to assert itself over the horrors of his subconscious. "Leo," he breathed, his voice rough. "Sorry. Bad dream." He tried to sit up, but he was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that shook his entire frame. He looked utterly wrecked, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He wrapped his arms around himself as if he were cold, though the apartment was warm. I can't stop seeing it," he whispered, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. "The surgery. The kid." He trailed off, shaking his head, unable to articulate the rest. And in that moment, he was not the confident, capable Dr. Vance. He was just a man, haunted and hurting and desperately in need of comfort. The space between us felt charged with a different kind of intimacy, one born not of quiet companionship, but of raw, shared vulnerability. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and he said the words that would redraw the map of our relationship forever. I don't want to be alone right now. Can I? Is it okay if I just..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He was looking past me, towards the open door of my bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at me to say no, to gently guide him back to the couch, to maintain the boundary that was keeping me safe. But looking at the sheer, unvarnished need in his face, I found I couldn't. The part of me that loved him, the part that would do anything to ease his pain, was stronger than the part that was afraid of getting hurt. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. He followed me into my bedroom like a sleepwalker. The room felt impossibly small with both of us in it. I got into bed, on my usual side, and pulled the covers up, my body rigid with a mixture of terror and anticipation. He hesitated for a moment in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the faint light from the hall. Then, he moved to the other side of the bed and slid under the covers, fully clothed in his t-shirt and sweats. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, a careful foot of space between us. The mattress dipped with his weight, the subtle shift in equilibrium a seismic event in the quiet of the room. Neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small distance that separated us. I focused on my breathing, trying to make it slow and even, terrified he would hear the wild, chaotic rhythm of my heart. We lay like that for what felt like an eternity, two separate islands in the same sea of blankets. I was hyper-aware of every tiny detail. The scent of the antiseptic hospital soap that always clung to him, the soft whisper of fabric as he shifted his weight, the sheer, overwhelming fact of his physical presence beside me. It was everything I had ever secretly wanted, and it was a more refined form of torture than I could have ever imagined. Because it was built on a lie, a pretext. He was here for comfort, not for me. He needed a warm body next to him to chase away the nightmares. It could have been anyone. I was just convenient. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut, even as another part of me, the hopeful, foolish part, cherished the simple, devastating fact that he had chosen me. Then he moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift. He turned onto his side, his back to me. A moment later, he spoke, his voice a low murmur, muffled by his pillow. Is this okay, Leo? For you? The question was a gift. He was still thinking of me, even in his own distress. He was asking for consent, not just assuming my comfort. The consideration, the innate kindness of it, undid me. It's okay, Elias, I whispered back to the dark. It's fine. Another long silence. Then, he shifted again, moving backward, just an inch, until his back was pressed lightly against mine. The point of contact, from my shoulders down to my legs, was electric. A current of warmth and life passed between us, and my entire body tensed in response. I held my breath, waiting for him to pull away, to realize what he was doing. But he didn't. He just settled into the position, letting out a long, slow sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. And a few moments later, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He was asleep, and I was wide awake, my back pressed against his, a human shield against his nightmares. I lay there for hours, rigid and unmoving, terrified that the slightest twitch would break the spell. The physical contact was overwhelming, a sensory overload that sent my mind spinning. I could feel the steady beat of his heart through his back, a slow, powerful drum that seemed to sync with my own frantic pulse. I felt the rise and fall of his chest with every breath he took. It was the most intimate I had ever been with anyone, this silent, unconscious sharing of breath and space and warmth. And through the anxiety, through the fear of my own feelings, a profound sense of peace began to settle over me. For tonight, at least, he was here. He was safe, and he had turned to me for that safety. Whatever the reason, whatever the pretext, he was here. And in the deep, quiet hours of the night, with his warmth seeping into me, I allowed myself to believe that it was enough. This became our new ritual. It wasn't spoken of. It was never discussed in the light of day. But 3 or 4 nights a week, Elias would end up at my apartment, and we would end up in my bed. The pretense of the couch was abandoned. He would simply walk down the hall to my room, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The arrangement remained chaste, a carefully observed truce. We would lie with our backs to each other, a thin line of contact between us, a silent acknowledgement of the comfort we were both drawing from the arrangement. He slept soundly when he was here, the nightmares kept at bay by my presence. And I, in turn, began to sleep too, lulled by his steady breathing, my body slowly learning to relax in his proximity. But my mind never fully shut down. Part of me was always awake, always aware, cataloging the subtle shifts in this new, fragile intimacy. Some nights, the unspoken rules would bend. He might shift in his sleep, his arm falling across my waist, his hand resting on my hip. The first time it happened, I froze, my entire nervous system on high alert. His touch was casual, unconscious, a simple byproduct of sleep. But to me, it felt like a brand. It was a heavy, warm weight that seemed to sear through my clothes, through my skin, directly into my soul. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, my mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. I willed him to stay like that, and at the same time, I was terrified of what it meant. Was it possible he was feeling something too? Or was his subconscious just seeking out a source of warmth, of comfort, with no more thought than a plant turning toward the sun? The ambiguity was killing me. Every morning, he would wake up, untangle himself without a word, and the distance would be back, the invisible wall of our friendship firmly in place. He would thank me for letting him stay, his tone casual, friendly, as if we had done nothing more intimate than share a pizza. And I would nod, my own voice just as casual, my heart feeling like a bruised and tender thing in my chest. The tension was building inside me, a slow, rising tide. I was living a double life. In the daylight, I was Leo, the supportive friend. At night, I was the guardian of his sleep, the secret keeper of an intimacy he may not have even been aware of. My photography became my only outlet. I couldn't go back to the mountains yet. My body was still mending, but I found a new subject. I started taking self-portraits. They were stark, honest images, explorations of the geography of my own healing body, the scars that mapped my trauma. But they were also about him. In the way I framed a shot, in the use of shadow and light. I tried to capture the yearning, the loneliness, the quiet hope that defined my existence. I was trying to photograph the invisible, the space between us, the weight of everything left unsaid. My studio, my darkroom, became the only place I could be fully honest about the depth of my feelings for Elias. The breaking point, the moment the ritual was shattered and rebuilt into something new, came on a Thursday night in late winter. A cold snap had descended on the city, encasing everything in a layer of ice. Elias had been quiet all evening, a deeper, more thoughtful silence than his usual post-work exhaustion. He seemed troubled by something, his gaze distant, his answers to my questions monosyllabic. We went to bed early, falling into our usual positions, back to back. But I could feel that he wasn't sleeping. The tension radiated from him, a palpable energy in the quiet room. His breathing was too shallow, his body too still. I lay awake as well, my own anxiety mirroring his, wondering what was wrong, but afraid to break the silence and ask. Hours passed. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside and the frantic beating of my own heart. And then he moved. He turned over, slowly, deliberately, to face me. I felt the shift in the mattress, the whisper of the sheets. I kept my own back to him, my eyes squeezed shut, feigning sleep. But I could feel his gaze on me, a tangible pressure on my back. I waited, every nerve ending alight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. I could feel him wrestling with something, some internal debate. And then, his voice, when it came, was so soft it was almost a part of the silence itself. A raw, hesitant whisper in the dark. Leo, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could speak even if I wanted to. The sound of my own name on his lips in that moment, in this place, felt profoundly, terrifyingly intimate. He must have thought I was asleep, because a long moment passed. I felt him shift again, as if he were about to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of our unspoken arrangement. But then he spoke again, his voice even quieter, laced with a vulnerability that cracked my heart wide open. Can I ask you something stupid? That was what did it. The self-deprecation, the fear in his voice. It broke through my own paralysis. Slowly, I turned over to face him. In the faint moonlight filtering through the gap in the curtains, I could just make out his face. His eyes were wide, dark pools of uncertainty. He was propped up on one elbow, looking down at me. The space between us was now a chasm of mere inches, filled with a tension so thick I could taste it, metallic and electric on my tongue. My own voice, when I finally found it, was a reedy, breathless thing. Yeah, he swallowed, his throat moving in the dim light. He looked from my eyes to my mouth and back again. The air crackled. The entire universe seemed to have shrunk to the space of this bed, to the distance between his face and mine. He seemed to be searching for something in my expression, permission, or perhaps a warning. Whatever he saw there must have been enough. Would it be, he started, his voice barely audible, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. He paused, took a breath, and tried again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us. It was not a demand. It was not a proposition. It was a plea. It was a raw, honest admission of a desire that he was terrified to voice, terrified I would reject. It was the most vulnerable thing anyone had ever said to me. In that one question, he was laying his own confusion, his own need, bare. He was giving me all the power. And in that moment, all the months of anxiety, of longing, of torturous uncertainty, they all coalesced into a single, shining point of clarity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a wave of something else, something fierce and protective and overwhelmingly tender. He was waiting for an answer. His eyes were filled with a desperate, fragile hope. And I realized that all this time I had been so focused on my own secret, my own fear of rejection, that I hadn't truly seen his. He was just as scared as I was. Maybe more so. He was the one stepping off the ledge, venturing into a territory he clearly didn't understand. And he was asking me if it was safe to land. I didn't trust my voice. So instead, I just nodded. a small, almost imperceptible movement. But in the charged silence of the room, it was a shout. It was a resounding, unequivocal declaration. His eyes fluttered closed for a second, a brief expression of relief washing over his face. And then, he leaned down. The last few inches separating us dissolved. His lips met mine. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not hungry or demanding. It was tentative. It was soft. It was unbelievably gentle. It was a question, an exploration, a confession. His lips were warm, and they trembled slightly against mine. He tasted faintly of the chamomile tea he'd had hours before. It was a kiss of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. I lifted a hand, my fingers shaking, and rested it on his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of his stubble under my palm. The simple contact, the act of touching him with intent for the first time, sent a tremor through me. He deepened the kiss ever so slightly in response, a soft sigh escaping him, a sound that was equal parts relief and longing. It lasted only a few moments, but it felt like a lifetime. It was the end of the ritual and the beginning of everything else. When he finally pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. There was only the quiet, thrumming aftermath, the feeling of a door having been unlocked, a path revealed. And in the dark, with his breath warm against my skin, I finally felt the cold knot of fear inside me begin to melt away, replaced by the fragile, terrifying, and unbelievably beautiful bloom of hope. The morning after was a study in silence. A new kind of silence, not the companionable quiet we were used to, but a brittle, awkward one, fraught with the weight of the night before. I woke up first. Sometime after the kiss, we had fallen asleep, and I had woken to find myself curled against his chest, his arm thrown protectively over me. The intimacy of it, so effortless and natural in the haze of sleep, felt impossibly complicated in the harsh light of dawn. I slipped out of his embrace as gently as I could, my movements careful, as if trying not to startle a wild animal. He didn't stir. I watched him for a moment, his face relaxed in sleep, and the tenderness I felt was so sharp it was almost painful. I was terrified. He woke up while I was making coffee, the sound of the grinder echoing in the silent apartment. He came into the kitchen, avoiding my eyes, and mumbled a good morning. The easy familiarity between us was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. He poured himself a coffee, his movements stiff and economical. He didn't lean against the counter and chat with me like he usually did. He stood by the window, staring out at the gray morning, his shoulders rigid. I tried to act normal, to bridge the new chasm that had opened between us. "Sleep okay?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. He just nodded, not turning around. "Fine," he said. The word was a slammed door. He left 10 minutes later. He had to get to the hospital early, he said, a meeting he'd forgotten about. It was an obvious lie. He gathered his things with a hurried, nervous energy, still not quite meeting my gaze. At the door, he paused, his hand on the knob. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to say something, to acknowledge what had happened, to say it was a mistake, or that it meant something, or anything at all. But he just turned his head slightly and said, "Thanks for everything, Leo," and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound echoed in the sudden, profound emptiness of the apartment. I stood there for a long time, the warm coffee mug growing cold in my hands, and I felt a familiar, sickening dread pool in my stomach. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss had been a moment of weakness for him, a desperate act of loneliness, and now, in the clear light of day, he was filled with regret. And I, in my foolishness, had let myself hope. The days that followed were some of the worst of my life. The silence from Elias was absolute. He didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't show up at my door after his shifts. The ritual was broken, and with it, it seemed, our friendship. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap with a painful, stupid hope, only to crash when I saw it was someone else. The sanctuary of my apartment had become a prison, every corner of it a reminder of him. His empty mug was still on the coffee table. His favorite blanket was still folded on the couch. The ghost of his presence was everywhere, a constant, silent accusation. I replayed the kiss, his question, over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every nuance, searching for the clue I must have missed. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his voice? Had I projected my own feelings onto a simple, desperate need for human contact? The pain of his absence was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. It was worse than the loneliness I had felt after my accident. This was a new, more potent kind of desolation. I had allowed myself to believe in a possibility, and the loss of that possibility was devastating. The hope had been the cruelest part. It had made me vulnerable, and now I was paying the price. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar alchemy of the darkroom, but my hands shook, and my focus was shattered. Every image I developed seemed to mock me, a pale imitation of the emotion I was trying to convey. I felt foolish and exposed and deeply, deeply hurt. He had initiated it. He had asked, and then he had vanished, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. The tenderness I had felt for him began to curdle into a bitter mixture of anger and resentment. After 5 days of agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was eating me alive. I would rather have a painful truth than this corrosive uncertainty. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake. I needed to hear him say he regretted it. I needed something, anything, to close this gaping wound. So I did something I had never done before. I went to his apartment. It was late, after 10 at night. I knew he was likely to be home from his shift. Standing outside his door, my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock. This was it. This was the moment where our friendship would either be salvaged in some new and awkward form, or it would be officially pronounced dead. He opened the door after the second knock. He was still in his scrubs, his hair a mess, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. When he saw me, his eyes widened in surprise, and then a shuttered, guarded expression took over. He looked cornered. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, a physical barrier between us. The anger and hurt I had been nursing for days rose in my throat, hot and acidic. But when I spoke, my voice was quiet, stripped of all accusation. It was just tired. "Talk to me, Elias," I said. "Please, don't just disappear. You don't get to do that. Not after. Not to me." Something in my voice, in my face, must have broken through his defenses. The rigid set of his shoulders slumped. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "Leo," he sighed, a ragged, defeated sound. "Come in." He stepped back, and I walked into his apartment for the first time in months. It was sterile, impersonal. The walls were bare, the furniture functional. There were still boxes in the corner from when Clara had moved her things out. It felt like a temporary space, a place where no one actually lived. It was the complete opposite of my own cluttered, warm apartment. It was the loneliest room I had ever been in. He didn't turn on any more lights. We stood in the dim glow of the kitchen light, facing each other across the expanse of his living room. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at his own feet, as if they held the answers to the universe. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've been a coward." The confession, as quiet as it was, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I waited, giving him the space to continue. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a torment that stole my breath. "I don't know what I'm doing, Leo," he said, his voice cracking. "I kissed you, and the second I did, it was like everything shifted. The whole world tilted on its axis, and it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time, and that scared the hell out of me." He started pacing, a caged, restless energy pouring off him. I don't think about men that way. I never have. My whole life has been this one straight path. College, med school, residency, Clara. It was all laid out. And then I met you. And you were my patient, and then you were my friend. And it was the easiest, most real friendship I've ever had. And I told myself that's all it was. But it wasn't, was it? I just didn't let myself see it. He stopped and looked at me, his expression one of raw, painful confusion. I started needing to be at your place. I told myself it was because my apartment felt empty. But it wasn't that. It was because you were there. Being near you, it was like coming home. It was the only time the noise in my own head would stop. And I didn't understand it. I didn't want to understand it. That night, he continued, his voice dropping again. I lay there, and I knew you were awake. And all I could think about was how badly I wanted to turn over. How badly I wanted to touch you. And I couldn't stand it anymore. So I asked. I had to know. And when you said yes, and I kissed you, it was like a confirmation of something I had been denying for months, maybe years. And the morning after, I panicked. I looked at you, and all I could think was, what have I done? I've dragged you into my mess. I'm confused and lonely, and I just took advantage of your kindness. I felt like the worst person in the world. I thought I had ruined the best thing in my life. So I ran. It was the only thing I could think to do. I listened to his torrent of words, and the anger inside me dissolved, washed away by a tidal wave of empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't disgusted by what had happened. He was overwhelmed by it. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. I closed the distance between us, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. I stopped in front of him, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He looked at me, his gaze searching, desperate. Elias, I said, my voice soft but firm. Look at me, he did. You didn't take advantage of me. You couldn't. It's not possible, he frowned, confused. What do you mean? And so, standing there in the dim light of his lonely apartment, I finally told him my truth. I have been in love with you for years, I said. The words came out easily, simply. They were not a confession of shame, but a statement of fact. Probably since that day you brought my camera to the hospital. You were never just my friend, not to me. You were always more. So when you kissed me, you weren't taking something that wasn't offered. You were just finally accepting something that had been waiting for you all along. His face crumpled. The carefully constructed walls he had built around himself crumbled into dust. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. He just stared at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief, relief, and a dawning, wondrous understanding. Leo, he whispered, my name a prayer. He took a half step forward, his hands coming up to frame my face, his thumbs gently brushing my cheekbones. His touch was hesitant, reverent. I don't know what this is, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what it means, or where we go from here. I'm so scared of hurting you. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes for a moment, savoring the simple, honest contact. You don't have to have it all figured out, I whispered back. We don't have to label it. We don't have to do anything. We can just be together. We can start there. He let out a shuddering breath, a sound of profound release. He leaned in and rested his forehead against mine, just as he had after the kiss. But this time, it was different. There was no uncertainty, no fear. There was only the quiet, steady truth of our shared confession. Okay, he whispered. Okay, we can start there. And in that moment, in the sterile quiet of his apartment, something new and fragile and beautiful was born. The fear and the confusion were still there, lingering in the shadows, but they were no longer the most powerful things in the room. Hope was, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt solid, real, and within our grasp. We didn't go back to my apartment that night. We stayed at his. It felt important, somehow, to start this new chapter in his space, to begin the process of filling his empty rooms with something other than ghosts. We didn't talk much more. The emotional exhaustion was too great. But he led me to his bedroom, and we lay down, and for the first time, we faced each other. He reached for my hand under the covers, his fingers lacing with mine, a firm, reassuring pressure. He didn't let go. He just held on, as if I were his anchor in a storm. And as I watched him finally drift off to sleep, his face peaceful and unguarded for the first time in weeks, I knew that the long, uncertain night was finally over. The sun was rising. The weeks that followed were a gentle unfurling. We moved slowly, cautiously, learning the rhythms of this new relationship. It was a landscape we were mapping together, step by tentative step. The defining characteristic of it all was honesty. We talked. We talked about his fears, his confusion, the ingrained expectations he was slowly dismantling. We talked about my years of quiet longing, the ache of my secret love for him. We laid all our cards on the table, all our vulnerabilities, all our hopes. And in that shared honesty, we found a new, more profound level of intimacy. The physical affection that had once been so fraught with ambiguity became simple and easy and right. A hand on the small of my back as we passed in the kitchen. A kiss on the forehead before he left for work. His head in my lap as we watched a movie. But this time, my fingers would be carding through his hair, a simple, comforting gesture that was both given and received without fear. His apartment began to change. I started leaving things there. A toothbrush, a book, a change of clothes. He bought a new coffee maker, one that made the kind of coffee I liked. One weekend, we went out and bought a huge, ridiculously vibrant painting for the big, empty wall in his living room. It was an abstract, a chaotic swirl of blues and greens and golds. It was full of life, and it transformed the space. He started to look different, too. The constant, weary tension in his shoulders began to ease. He smiled more, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He was still the dedicated, brilliant doctor, but he was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. He was learning to share it. Our nights were the most sacred time. The ritual of sleeping in the same bed was reinstated, but it was a completely new thing. There was no more chaste, careful distance. We slept tangled together, a mess of limbs and shared warmth, my head on his chest, his arms securely around me. I fell asleep to the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath my ear, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my own peace. There was no more anxiety, no more second-guessing. There was just the quiet, profound comfort of being exactly where I was supposed to be. I was home. One rainy Saturday afternoon, a few months after his confession, I was in my darkroom, working on a new series of prints. The red safe light cast a warm, otherworldly glow on everything. I was so engrossed in my work, carefully agitating the developer tray, that I didn't hear him come in. I only knew he was there when I felt his arm slide around my waist from behind, his chin coming to rest on my shoulder. He stood there for a long moment, just holding me, watching the image slowly emerge on the paper in the tray. It was one of the self-portraits I had taken during those long, lonely weeks of his silence. It was a stark, shadowed image of my face, my eyes full of a yearning I hadn't been able to hide. "I see it now," he said softly, his breath warm against my ear. "What you were feeling then. I'm sorry it took me so long to see." I leaned my head back against his shoulder, my hand still in the chemical bath. "You were busy," I said, my voice gentle. "Saving lives. Figuring out your own." He tightened his arms around me. "I was blind," he said, "but you waited for me. You were so patient." I turned my head to kiss his cheek, the faint, familiar scent of him filling my senses. "Some things," I said, looking back at the photograph taking its final shape, "are worth waiting for." We began to build a life, not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 tiny, mundane moments of shared existence. We cooked dinner together, bickering over how much garlic was too much garlic. We went for long walks, my stride now steady and strong, his hand always finding its way into mine. He would sit and watch me edit photos for hours, asking questions, fascinated by the process, by the way I saw the world through my lens. And I learned the landscape of his life, the pressures of the hospital, the names of his colleagues, the quiet satisfaction he took in his work in healing people. We weren't two separate entities anymore. We were a shared world, our borders overlapping until they became one. The first time I finally felt strong enough, we went back to the mountains. Not to climb, not yet, just to walk. We found a trail that wound through a forest of ancient pines, the air crisp and clean. We walked for hours, not talking much, just soaking in the quiet majesty of the place. We stopped at a viewpoint overlooking a vast, blue lake, the water perfectly still, reflecting the snow-capped peaks like a mirror. He stood beside me, his shoulder pressed against mine, and we watched the sun begin to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had pieced my body back together so I could stand here, in this place of beauty and peace. But he had done so much more than that. He had pieced me back together on the inside, too. He had taken the broken, lonely parts of me and shown them they were worthy of love. He had healed me in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. That night, lying in bed, the scent of pine still clinging to our clothes, he turned to me in the dark. "Leo," he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder. "What we have, it's the truest thing in my life." I kissed him, a slow, deep kiss full of all the words I didn't need to say. It was true for me, too. The love I had once thought was a hopeless, impossible thing had become the very foundation on which I was building my future. It was the quiet center of my world. He was my home. And so we learned. We learned that healing is not a destination you arrive at, but a process you commit to day after day. It is not always about the grand, dramatic moments of rescue, but about the quiet, consistent presence of someone who chooses to stay. He was the doctor who saved my life. That much is a medical fact. But he was also the man who taught me how to live again, not by fixing what was broken, but by loving it, by showing me that scars are not a sign of weakness, but a map of where we have been, and a testament to the fact that we survived. And in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, a silence no longer filled with tension or fear, but with a deep and abiding peace, we found that we were both, in our own ways, finally healing.